All right, well, I'll just go ahead and begin. I hope we have people maybe joining in this discussion as we get off, but my introductory words will mostly be just some background. I'm Ben Welly. I'm Director of Integrated Transport and Innovation at the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. WRI works globally on sustainable mobility across a wide geography of international offices that I won't go through. Many of you may know this, and participated in previous webinars and activities and events with WRI and our Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. So I just wanted to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very interesting and pertinent discussion on public transport and COVID recovery. I'm not going to spend much time on the background so we can get to our great panelists, but I will say one thing. As outlined in actually a blog that my colleague Sergio Avaleda and myself published just in the last day and posted on our WRI Insights blog for those of you who are interested. But we're seeing that public transport is now more important than ever. It's providing a vital service to essential workers. We value incredibly these emergency workers and what they're doing for us all. But it's also one area we can look to for economic recovery. It can help create jobs fast while lowering emissions, reducing road fatalities, and really allowing more people to access jobs, opportunities, education, services in a more equal manner than, say, building highway networks. And there are great opportunities to make this investment happen with recovery investments, whether that be at the national level, through development banks, or through actions by states and local municipalities. I'm excited today to hear from our panelists. We're joined by my colleague Sergio Avaleda, who's our WRI Urban Mobility Director, Adriana Lobo, our WRI Mexico Executive Director, Beth Osborne, who is Director of Transportation for America, Daizong Liu, who is WRI China Cities Director, and lastly, Marusha Kardama, who's Secretary General of the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, also known as SLOCAT. We are going to get off to these remarks here from Sergio Avaleda, WRI Urban Mobility Director. Sergio, you also previously have served as the Secretary of Mobility in Sao Paulo, which is South America's largest city. Sergio, I know you want to communicate some issues of some serious issues occurring with public transport, but also opportunities for looking forward. So I'll just quickly hand it over to you. Thank you.
You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining this important conversation about public transport and COVID-19 recovery. The main characteristic of public transport is the efficiency in moving a large number of people. So when we observing to start this crisis, public transportation was one of the first sector that was affected by the pandemic. And it is very impressive because at the same time that you need to reduce the offer of public transport to contribute to reduce social interaction, we should maintain the level of service because we need to maintain this essential services for citizens. We need to maintain healthcare, food, and the other essential services for cities. So just right now, we need some cities that suspended service, but some cities that maintain the service to maintain the essential services. And we are observing an important gap between revenues and expenditures. And for example, in Brazil, we are reading reports that show a daily loss of more than 1 billion reais. It is almost $188 million per day that the system are losing every day. But this situation, this gap between revenues and expenditures in public transportation is not we're not observing it only during this pandemic. It was occurring before the pandemic. We are observing the public transportation systems in different parts of the world were losing passengers for different reasons: ride-hailing services, competition, lack of investment, lack of data, poor quality of service, and these financial constraints precede social isolation measures. But just right now, we are observing exacerbation of this crisis. As Benjamin mentioned, by serving essential workers and to the capacity of public transportation to keep emergency services, food services, healthcare services, public transport has become not a service for riders, but for everyone in cities. Everyone needs to maintain public transportation operational and sustainable. During this crisis, we are predicting 3 different stages. One, this stage that we are observing the majority of countries in the world when authorities decide to maintain social distance between people. The second step, and we hope it will be soon, it will be the transition period. And the third one, we are recommending to design a new configuration of public transport in cities. Just right now, we are observing, as I mentioned, reduced and suspended services. Porto Alegre, a city in the south of Brazil, are operating with 25% of the demand, but they are facing 70% of the costs. Public transportation operates with a high fixed costs. And with this gap, we are observing some operators are going on the way to bankruptcy. If it will occur, we will have a lot of issues in cities. If we collapse the public transportation operators, we will increase the private vehicle use and the informal operators. Some cities around the world spent a lot of efforts to formalize and organize their public transports. If we lose this capacity and this structure, we will observe an informal transport that is not so good, that's not observing rules, standards, and timetables, and the other issues. So stimulus plans, economic stimulus plans must be considered public transportation, urban mobility as a strategic and essential services. So they should send money to keep and maintain the bus operators and the public transportation structure with its capacity to restart when we restart the economic activities. And it requests a lot of coordination of efforts by local, state, and national governments to work together to prevent sector collapse. The transition period, probably my colleague Daison will mention it in China, demand returns slowly. It's not in the same rhythm that the economic activities, because people will be afraid to share public spaces, to share crowded spaces. So you will observe that economic activities will return, but not in the same pace we will observe the demand in public transportation. So this kind of support from national governments, local governments, should continue to keep and maintain the operational capacity in public transportation. And during this period, we should balance safe distance with financial pressure to increase ridership. So the economic plans should maintain support to the public transportation. And I think to the future, this crisis can open important opportunities to reshape the public transportation. So as we are observing the financial crisis in public transportation, and it is exacerbated just right now, we need to work to find new revenue sources to ensure our public transportation operational capacities. So we need to consider in our agenda the congestion fees, park prices, and urban tolls to help cities to maintain public transportation, not only from the fare or from the public budget, but to create new services. We need to work to improve high quality buses and transit infrastructure. We need to be more efficient. It's a great opportunity to design and implant bus corridors, or better, because it's cheaper and quicker to implant exclusive lanes for buses to increase efficiency and productivity. Modernize and electrify bus fleets. These programs that will help to recover economics should consider the green agenda, especially green buses, electrify bus fleets, to help to accelerate economic activities, to recover economic activities, at the same time to offer better public transportation and better and green agenda in public transportation. Cycling and walking, we are observing that it's essential in this crisis. And for the future, people can access the public transportation by walking and cycling. It's safe, it's green, and it will help to feed the public transportation if you redesign our streets to be more cycling and walking friendly. And what we observing during this crisis, for example, in São Paulo, we have 39 cities in the metropolitan zones with 39 mayors, 39 secretaries of urban mobility, 39 different decisions to organizing the operational services during the crisis. It's terrible. We need to redesign our governance, to coordinate, especially in the metropolitan zones, to have only one coordination, one planning, to reduce costs, increase efficiency, and increase quality to attract more users. This is my first thoughts for this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio. Great thoughts. And we'll quickly just turn to Adriana Lobo, who is the WRI Mexico Executive Director. Adriana has many years of experience leading on sustainable mobility in Mexico and across Latin America to make sustainable transport and transport finance a reality. Adriana, you are working a lot in, of course, places like Mexico as well as Colombia. There's been a lot of progress in these places on establishing things like bus rapid transit, and for example, in Mexico City or Bogota, to really increase the rate of bicycling, improve road safety. What lessons can we learn from Mexico or Colombia on looking towards the future for how we invest in sustainable mobility and help our economy?
Well, good morning to everyone. A pleasure to be with you to talk about such an important topic as the future of our mobility. I think the transport sector in general has been one of the most affected sectors in the whole world, not only public transport, but all sectors. But our sector in cities has been deeply affected. I would say that the first very positive experiences, we are still in very early days, but I would say bikes are bringing really like the best and most important help at the moment. Bogota, for example, has opened a lot of new spaces for bikes in the city. Jalisco, Guadalajara here in Mexico is really looking for the same. And Mexico City is they were already devoting a lot of space to talk about better neighborhood mobility. Usually we take care a lot of the trunk lines, but there was already a lot of interest in how people in the neighborhoods have better mobility and really increasing the access and walk and bike. I think biking has shown to be very resilient. When they had the earthquake, we really saw something very similar, that people could only take bikes. It's private, we can use our own energy. It's very flexible. So I think bikes will be a great solution. And what we see is that we have to take advantage of the space before cars get back. And just be very careful about increased speeds, because there is a tendency of more accidents in many of our cities, or hard accidents, because the speed has increased so much. And then to talk about transit, we have been talking, we are part of an association of authorities here in Mexico. We have been trying to study and to understand the issues together. And we have seen up to the moment, we are in stage 3 just for this week. that numbers in demand have reduced by 40%, but it might get worse, just like Porto Alegre. And costs only can reduce 25%. So we are having a very important gap. And as Sergio said, we don't expect it to go back in the next few months. It's a sector that gives job in Mexico to over 160,000 people. So we have to take care of these jobs too. And what we have seen is that, unfortunately, the ones that are more in danger are the companies that have just started their effort to be regular and to be more formal in Mexico, because they have just bought buses, so they are still financially not very strong, but they have to deal with this huge financial issue, right? What we have been talking about is, first, that it's very important that authorities really help them to renegotiate credits, guarantees, and any kind of thing. Governments are also feeling very much under pressure because there is no money in the states and municipalities. So there is a lot of pressure. So we have been exploring to do the things similar to the curve of COVID, how to flatten the curve and not let them, die and break in an early stage. So we are exploring options, of course, subsidies, but I think one of the most interesting is exploring financial solutions that might help families directly with prepaid cards, and that we can smoothen the way we deliver the money back to the bus owners by paying some of the money now and then smoothening. This can also create some effect that it doubles down the impact of the money that's delivered by the government by helping the families directly, but also the bus owners and bus drivers. Also, it helps to really be looking at how the numbers really come up when we are in the stage of getting back to work. So as you see, it's just an exploration phase, and we really hope to have a lot more to share in the next days. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Very interesting things happening in Mexico, and much different situation where there may not be funding for some of this support. So getting creative in how to really solve that is a crucial question. So let's now move to the U.S. perspective. We're really happy to have Beth Osborne joining us. She is Director of Transportation Alternatives. It's an initiative based here in the United States. And Beth, you also served at the US DOT actually during the last economic stimulus after the Great Recession, and managed the Tiger Grant Program, which was meant to send innovative grants for economic recovery. If you can put those letters together, that's what Tiger stands for. But Transportation for America has released guidance on how a new stimulus might invest in transport in the United States, but also create jobs and set us on a more sustainable, healthy, green path. So I'd be curious really to hear your thoughts. Thank you for joining.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yeah, it was Tiger's, the Transportation Investment Generating Economic Recovery Program. And I always liked it because I graduated from Louisiana State University, which is the Tigers. Anyway, on transportation, we've released 2 documents, in fact. One is recommendations for how we should handle economic stimulus. But I think I'm going to focus a little bit more on a document that we released that is focused on lessons learned from the last Recovery Act, because as you pointed out, I lived through its development. I was on Capitol Hill, and my old boss, Senator Carper, was part of the team that negotiated the package, and then went to USDOT to implement it. And there were a lot of things we saw in its implementation that we should be learning from right now. It also happens to support the sort of investments that many of us would like to see that are more green, that are more equitable. So one of the things we discovered is, because funding was put out in big lumps with a lot of discretion to states and localities, but mostly states, to spend the money as they would like, it was not directed to the projects that created the most jobs quickly. It was meant to be economic stimulus, but that's not necessarily what we got. The money spent slowly. and it was spent many times on projects that don't create that many jobs per dollar. So we know transit creates more jobs, both short-term and long-term, than highways. And we know that highway and roadway state of repair projects create more jobs than highway expansions. When you do, or new highways. If you build new highways or roadways, or you expand them, you have to purchase a lot of right-of-way. And while there will be a handful of lawyers that will be very grateful for the work, that's really not the sort of economic stimulus that most of us are seeking. We want to put people to work in construction and in the industries that support the actual building of projects. And per dollar, that is much better through transit and highway or roadway state of repair. The other thing we learned was Congress has a propensity to not want to create a new project to meet its goals. It wants to pull something off the shelf. So the problem with that is if you want to generate economic recovery or stimulate jobs, you really need to design a program that targets your spending in that direction. What Congress does is they take a program off the shelf, and our transportation program is not meant for short-term job stimulation. It's meant to equitably allocate dollars throughout the 50 states and the territories and the District of Columbia to help them maintain and operate their transportation systems. And that money spends slowly, and it is not necessarily directed at job creation as a top priority or a priority at all. It might be a happy outcome, but it's not the same thing. And Congress thinks if you take that program off the shelf and pour money through it, that it will miraculously do something different than it was created to do. And that's something that those of us in the United States are going to have to fight if Congress seeks to do the same thing. We are seeking to point out to them that we need not use economic stimulus as an excuse to keep building things the way we have for the last 70 years, with all of its flaws. Its flaws in terms of poor safety outcomes, particularly those who are not in an automobile. It's inequitable outcomes, because if you cannot afford one reliable automobile per person over 16 years of age in your household, you really can't do what you need to do in our society. And in terms of being cleaner, when even short trips require you to burn gasoline, there's really no way to support green outcomes and protect the climate. So we are seeing that our big interest groups, like the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, the American Public Transit Association, are asking for a long-term reauthorization of our current programs as part of a stimulus package. Now, how a 6-year program is immediate stimulus is a big mystery to me. I do understand that over the long term, they'd like to see a lot more money, and maybe that means more projects and more jobs, but it's certainly not immediate, and those programs spend very slowly. And what's also interesting is, whereas we've always paid for our program with a user fee, a gas tax, this basically shows our major interest groups throwing their hands up and saying, forget it, we're just going to pay for our program with general funds and debt. This is also a huge opportunity for those of us interested in climate equity, safety, and those things. If there's no user fee, the old rules about how all the money should go to highways and highway expansion is gone. Why shouldn't at least as much money go to transit, if not more? And this is something we in my community are starting to really push on. And what's super exciting is, in the United States, I think we've all learned why transit is an essential public utility, which is very new for the United States. Through our recent recovery efforts, Congress put $25 billion into transit operations, which is the first time the federal government has funded transit operations in any meaningful way ever, because they never viewed it as their job. But through the shutdown, we have realized, we have been reminded that 36% of those who use public transportation are essential workers. And while many of us may not be required to take transit to get to the grocery or to get to the hospital, it doesn't do us any good to get to those places if they're not running. If you get to the hospital because you drove yourself there and your nurse isn't there, you haven't gotten anything. So I think we've all learned that we're all transit dependent now, and that is an opening that we have never seen in the United States to really push a different type of recovery.
Great. Thank you so much for those comments. And now we're going to go on the other side of the world, where Daizong Liu is with us. He's the director of the WI Cities in China and also long experience working on sustainable transport in various organizations in China. Daizong, thank you for joining us late in the evening. I know you have a few slides to show, but why?
Yeah, I will be quick.
What's going on in China as you're emerging or trying to emerge from this, and also what kind of investments might be considered by the national government that we're hearing about?
Okay, can you hear me, right? So first, let me introduce the full story about China on the COVID-19 transportation impact. So the right side, the figure show you that's the most serious period is early of February. That's almost 80% of the travel demand have been dropped. So it's quite serious. And then for the left side figure, you can find the recovery lines for the passenger traffic. The first one come back is the car traffic. You can find it's a blue lines, it's a congestion, but actually show you the car traffic. So today, car traffic in China is almost as normal as 2019. But we actually, before we are very worried about the public transportation, but let's see the green line is urban public transportation. It's not so bad. Today, it's also a recovery very fast. But compare the only thing need to be concerned is about long distance travel, like the high speed rail and the airplane. It's a really long term to recovery. Next slide, please. And here show you the Shanghai metro system's daily readership. So today, April, the early week of April, that's Shanghai's metro system's readership already 70% as normal. So it's really give our a lot of confidence to encourage us to continue to promote the public transportation. Next slide, please. And when we look back about the Wuhan lockdown period, what happened? We are really surprised that the shared bikes really play a very important role. You can find the shared bikes almost taking about 56% of overall passenger trips, compared with the bus only the 26%. So it's really surprised us a lot that the shared bike is so helpful during the Wuhan lockdown period. And the next slide, please. And the people from the shared bikes, the data, you can find the people use the bike a long distance and the long times on the bikes. And you can find the speed is slowed down because they need to carry the stuff or some food. So this is why speed is not go up. Even the street is very empty, but speed still drop off. Next slide, please. So that's the overall pictures of transportation impacts by the COVID-19. So today, China are thinking about the economic stimulus. So we just launched the new infrastructure scheme last month at the end of March. So they are quite focused on the new infrastructure, means the digital infrastructure. That let's saw in the left side. This is the 4 pillar about the 5G network. It's one focus about the new infrastructure. And also they think about the industry internet, because China is worried about that the industry will be moved out of China. So they more need the connection along the industry supply chain. So they want to promote the industry's industrial internet. And also they want to promote the digital platforms, include the AI technologies and the data. And this is a basement of the new infrastructure scheme. And they also find some sector as application. That include the transportation, energy, or agriculture. So for example, they are talking about how to apply these new infrastructures into the sector like transportation. They are quite focused on some areas like the EV infrastructures. So they will pay a lot of investment into the charging facilities. They also think about e-freight, the roads, as a new infrastructure to using 5G industrial AI data. And also China still need to investment into the public transportation because China have no choice. They still need to come back to the very high density urban life. So they are decide to continue to investment to the capacity, to improve the capacity of the urban public transportation. So they were also thinking about the urban rail and the metro systems. And the last one, they want to promote the new mobility, like the bike sharing is a really good performance. So they are still continue to think about new mobility to get more investment. And also they want to integrate with a safer perspective. So the overall scheme maybe will be the 5 to 6 trillion US dollar for the next 5 to 10 years. So as the whole package. So next slide, please. So the last one we are worried about today is the revenge pollution. You can find the coal consumption in China is go back very quickly, and also the air pollution. You can find Wuhan, the last 2 weeks, Wuhan's air pollution is really come back compared with other cities. So this is one thing we thinking about how to integrate our climate vision ambition with our economic stimulus scheme. So that's what we want to share with all of our friends. Thank you.
Great to hear this perspective from China, and wow, that's quite a large investment actually over the next 5 years from China. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. So let's take this more to maybe the global perspective, and we're really pleased to be joined by Marusha Kardama. Marusha is the Secretary General of SLOCAT, which is the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport. She brings a wealth of experience on global policy and sustainable mobility, and particularly with regards to climate and the SDGs and these matters. Marusha, what opportunities are you seeing for raising ambition on climate goals, on sustainable development goals, and really also achieving economic recovery at the same time?
Thank you very much, Ben, and thanks to everyone for being there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's great to see WRI putting together this sort of webinars and knowing that it's the first of a series. Certainly much appreciated. Difficult to add because a lot of things have been said so far, but I would like to focus perhaps on people, on governments, and on that financial and investment revolution that we know is so very needed in our sector. Let's just start thinking about people, because people and ambition should go hand in hand. And I think that we are going through a moment in which we have before COVID and after COVID. Is another new VC and AC. So in VC times before COVID, we already had incredible movements in the street, led by the younger generations, many times triggered by measures related to transport, and really the fight for climate action and the fight for action against inequality was already taken to the streets. There was, let's think about the flight shame movement, for instance. There was more conversation in households about buying, for instance, an electric vehicle. There was much more attention to sustainable low carbon transport matters in the international arena. And now we are AC, after COVID. As people, perhaps we have understood a bit better the importance of science. Perhaps I want to think that we have seen that behavioral change can happen really fast, can be unfolded really fast. There was very recently, Michael Corney, the economist, was talking about the change in the scale of values, how we're going to value things differently. Perhaps we have realized about the importance of public services, about common goods, and perhaps this is an opportunity for public transit and mobility to be understood as that common good, as that public service that we need to protect. If I move now to governments, I would like to reflect a bit upon the fact that governments operate at the national level and they also operate at the multilateral level in multilateral instances. Obviously, the centrality of public policy to protect the common goods and to safeguard us from what I would call the common bads, I think is becoming very, very apparent in this crisis. Beth has given so many insights about what those recovery packages should be doing or not, that I'm not going to go there. Perhaps I'm going to have a word about the bailouts, the industry liquidity schemes. If we're going to bail out aviation, we should also be bailing out public transport. And we should also be taking all transport modes on a track, a progressive track, of course, but a track that is aligned with a low carbon economy, with a zero carbon economy, I would even say. It's interesting to see that, for instance, when we talk about the bailouts, there is a country like Denmark who has recently said they were not bail out companies which would be headquartered in tax havens. So we could think about similar things for transport. I am not saying that we can transpose this to the transport sector, but it opens food for thought. You know, what is it that these bailout schemes should or should not be doing in a phased out approach? And governments in the context of those multilateral entities to which they belong. Let's talk here about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. This year is not a year like any other in that context. In 2020, countries are required to submit two sets of documents, two policy frameworks. One of them is the nationally determined contributions, is the short-term perspective of the efforts that countries are going to be doing on mitigating emissions and on adapting to climate change. The ambition on transport needs to be dramatically increased from the first generation of NDCs, nationally determined contributions, that was submitted back in 2015. And there is clear ways to do so. I mean, very recently, jointly with many others, including WRI, we have put out there a campaign to try to support countries in this process of elaborating nationally determined contributions with a high level of ambition and specificity on transport. But this year, countries must also submit the longer term vision, what is called the long-term climate action strategies. And I think that this is an opportunity. These are in the horizon of 2050. And these are clearly an opportunity for us to support countries to move from the exacerbated focus on improved strategies and really tackle the structural changes needed in cities and in countries to go into avoid and shift strategies deeper than what they do through the nationally determined contributions. And the last reflection I would like to share is around what I would call some accelerators on the financial and investment revolution that we know is so required to really push through sustainable low carbon transport. Perhaps let me frame it. I'm going to talk about accelerators, but in the understanding that progress on these two particular items I'm going to focus on has been extraordinarily slow. But the signs BC, before COVID, were there. We were going slowly in the right direction. So the idea is that the recovery packages in the AC era should actually maintain at least that and push it forward. And I think that the first one I would like to underscore is access by and for subnational governments to finance. Finance that is emitted at the national level and that is also emitted by international financial institutions. We know that subnational governments are the ones who carry the bulk of delivering public services, including public transport. And we know that they don't access sufficient economic and investing solutions and tools to actually be able to sustain the bulk of that implementation. And then it's aligning the portfolios, the lending portfolios of multilateral development banks to Paris-compatible, Paris-aligned objectives. Just before COVID exploded under our noses, the European Investment Bank, which is the largest multilateral financial institution and one of the biggest lenders in terms of climate portfolio, was actually starting a revolution. Perhaps you picked up that back in November 2019, they announced that they were no longer going to be funding projects related to oil and to gas in energy. They are starting the same process with transport. They've launched a consultation in which they're going to completely revisit the criteria they use in their lending portfolio for transport. And just a few days after European countries went into lockdown, they launched the consultation with the stakeholders. And in the very, very beginning of that consultation event, what they said is that this crisis is not going to derail us from the objective of aligning our transport portfolio to Paris Agreement compatibility. So I think that I am not saying that this is a given. I am not saying that ambition is going to occur alone. There's a lot of work ahead of us for those regulatory, fiscal, institutional frameworks to be meaningful and take us to that degree of ambition. But hopefully we can end this first round of interventions with a bit of a positive tone and tell ourselves that there are some entry points for ambition that require all the knowledge, all the advocacy, and all the dialogue we can pump in them as possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Marusha. Great to end on the discussion of what's happening at EIB and how that might reflect on other institutions and particularly the development banks as they look forward. I'm going to shift now to the Q&A. We're getting a lot of questions. We're getting a lot of range of questions. You know, I think people are grappling with kind of what's going on. We're getting a lot of questions of like, how can you social distance on public transport? And I think this is kind of the question we're seeing is we are not going to have like a V-shaped recovery of public transport ridership. So how do we continue these services, keep them in a place where there can be a relative state of social distancing? How can we support these jobs that are in this sector? How can we even increase jobs in this sector to make further stimulus? And then sort of other questions around that we're getting around how could other modes like biking, Audrey, we're seeing in Bogota and Mexico, or Bogota in particular, where they've done these temporary measures. In Milan, they've announced that they're going to do something like 40 kilometers of roadway, maybe permanently, that are going to be for biking and walking, so people can have choices to alleviate the pressure that would be on public transport. But we know urban space is limited. We all can't be in private vehicles post-COVID. People can't afford private vehicles. They need to use these other modes. So I wonder if maybe I'll start with you, Adriana, on some thoughts on how cities might permanently start investing in these alternative modes of transport.
Well, Ben, I think first, like when you look at Bogota, they have been investing in these modes for a long time. It seems like Mexico City is also taking care very much. It's like in the periphery areas, we really need to take care of the costs. So I think these investments were coming. And I think the opportunity is that when you open temporary spaces, people who were using other modes can feel safe. You know, I think safety is one of the issues that have deterred people for the longest on using bikes. And if you open more safe space and people have the chance to experiment, what I have seen is that especially younger people, when they try bikes, when they use bikes, they never want to get back if they feel safe. So I think doing this at the stages where before the congestion gets back, after what Dyson has shown, I think the real important thing is to win spaces for buses and for bikes in a stage before cars start to get back, because otherwise that will be harder.
Great.
Ben, I will add that, you know, Oakland, California has recently closed 110, 115 kilometers of roadway, some of which may not be reopened to cars, in order to create more space for people to be outside, active, and socially distanced. There's a lot of evidence that shows that people who are active have stronger immune systems, that people that get fresh air and try to stay active are less likely to have the pneumonia, serious pneumonia if they get COVID. So these are really important public health issues. It's not just Oakland. We're seeing Denver, Minneapolis, smaller places like Louisville, Kentucky, and Burlington, Vermont, converting as many as a fourth of their roadways more towards people as opposed to cars. So I think that is something that allows us to experiment and hopefully not go back to where we were with a long economic downturn. I don't think we will have the rebound in car usage that to where we were right before. That's an unfortunate way for that to occur. And then on transit, I do think one of the things that, at least here in the United States, we have to consider, and maybe other places as well. In the United States, the notion has been if people aren't stuffed into a bus like a group of sardines, that the bus is not worthwhile. And we need to move away from that. We're going to have to run more buses with more space. Those of us with choice may be able to turn to other options, but a huge portion of our populations do not have that choice, and we have no choice but to make it a safe one.
I totally agree, and it's difficult because we've seen buses in here in DC, for example, they're going by with lots of people on them at some times. Daizhong, maybe you can comment. What's the outlook in China? Can we social distance and sustain the business of public transport, but also invest in it to make better jobs?
Okay. So first of all, in China, when you go to any metro system, you have to test your temperatures, and you need to use your mask. Then you can use your public transportation like a metro. And secondly, they issued a lot of apps. You need to book your seat on the bus one day before, so they can keep the buses with another buses is enough social distance space. So they launched some programs like this one, and also. They are start to thinking about to provide a longer the bus the kind of the bus types like the 18 meters longer as the bus vehicle to replace the 12 meters to increase the space inside the bus systems. But to be honest, there still be very difficult. And then another methodology they are using want to shift the people. So for example, they want the older people cannot use the bus during the peak hours. Now, before they can use the bus at any time, so the people older than 60 years, but now they cannot use it during the peak hours. And some industry, they need to shift the working period to the afternoon. Some industry in the morning. So they try to diversify the demand distribution among the whole days. So some approach like this.
Great.
Ben, one thing that is interesting, can I? In Latin America, for example, is that the crowdedness of the bus is part of the financial system. And in Mexico and in other places, there is basically no subsidy from the state. And I think this has to be absolutely rethought, because if we need more buses under less demand, it's of course that the whole economy of the sector is going to change. So it's very hard to think of a sector. We cannot increase tariffs because people really need bus to be cheap now. And by the other side, we have a decrease in income. So this new equation will definitely need to be rethought.
Great thoughts. Sergio, I'm going to turn to you. We've gotten a lot of questions sort of on what kind of policy measures could be put in place. What are we going to do about all the increased vehicle traffic that may be happening as we quote unquote reopen? What kinds of, you mentioned some policy measures we might be considering more longer term that might manage demand for vehicles. Perhaps this is going to be a big issue, not just the supply of public transport and building bicycle lanes, but how we manage demand for private vehicles.
Yes, Ben, thank you. São Paulo has a program. It started 25 years ago that create a no circulate day. Depends of your plate, you can or you are allowed or not allowed to circulate with your private car 1 day per week. It's to reduce traffic congestion. I think after this transition period, during the transition period, it's hard to take this decision because we will have the virus and the risk of contamination. But after we will have this, we will be protected from the virus by vaccine or because a huge number of people got the virus, we will have a normal life. I believe that. And in this period, it's a great period to redesign, as I mentioned, to reshape our public transportation environment. One of the good decisions is to stimulate to use public transportation. You can do it using the price of the fare, you can use improving quality of public transportation, you can use improving infrastructure, offering more reliability, more better time travel, but you should use some measures to restrict the use of private car and to collect money from the private car. If you elect to go to work by car and you spend $1 to do it, the society will pay $9, around $9 to subsidize your private car choice. So it's completely fair that creates some measures to collect money from the private car use that creates a lot of negative externalities to subsidize public transportation that creates a lot of positive externalities. It's kind of measure, I think it's a great time to start this discussion. The politicians and the lawmakers avoid to do it in the normal time, but in face of this crisis and this gap to sustain public transportation, I think it's a great time to start this discussion, to put it on the table. Thank you, Ben.
Great. You know, I'm going to ask, WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities has a series of papers for the World Resources Report on towards more equal cities. We're getting some questions on inclusiveness and equality. We are seeing this virus reveal the vast inequities in some of our societies, others more than less. Maybe I'll pose it my question about what are the opportunities to relieve some of the issues of inequality that are happening right now and provide public transport, walking and biking, transportation, access to opportunities more equally. I'll just open it up for anyone who wants to tackle that question. And do keep your answers short because we're getting very tight on time, and I do want to get to one last question before we wrap up.
If I may, Ben, Marusha here.
Please.
Um,
Go ahead.
just to bring something in the conversation that perhaps didn't come up yet, but I think this question you brought up gives us perhaps the opportunity of putting it in the equation of things. Informal transport services in many cities in the global south, isn't it? Which go there or exist in order to fill the gap of the lack of public transit or formal public transit, and how to some extent these are 100% a private sector run. They are experiencing complete loss. They're going to probably disappear, a good part of them. Not to mention that, of course, in a matatu, in a boda boda, how do you keep social distancing? You know, but the impact that has got in actually people being able to access jobs in many cities in the global south, people walk on the road for miles and miles during hours and hours, or they use this informal transit. So what is going to be is more of a question and a reflection. Not that I have an answer myself, but what's going to be that interface or that progressive discussion we need to have about the fact that informal transport services, in many occasions, they are just filling a gap of something that should exist, and that something is called public transit. So how do we factor in the equation as well the reality of big capital towns in the global south, where that public transit doesn't exist, and the alternative might disappear in the next couple of months?
And I'll add, this has elevated these issues into higher up into the minds of more people. Most people now are seeing problems that have always existed, but COVID-19 has shined a spotlight on it in a way that makes it harder for people to ignore. And it's, again, an unfortunate way for it to come to light, but we can take advantage of that. Even myself, I have known for years that we design our roadways to be safer in wealthier neighborhoods. But as I've been riding my bike to get some exercise and going further and further afield, it is so stark and clear to me when I get into poorer neighborhoods how dangerous they are, how the roadways are built to speed people through there as if no one would ever want to stop there. And as a bicyclist on that roadway, I really feel the attitude of the public officials that create that sort of environment. And I'm hearing it from people who have never thought about transportation and the way the built environment is created. And so we can capitalize on that and bring them into the conversation. I think we all, those of us who are in analysis and research, can continue to keep the conversation alive by looking at the areas that are redesigning roadways, even temporarily, to see what the impact is, not just on safety in these areas now, access to jobs, economic recovery, and who will have access to jobs, but also there's a lot of evidence that there's going to be a second wave of health problems, not just from COVID, but from mental health problems coming out of the stress of these days. And how do the areas that have made it possible for people to move around outside safely fare this, as opposed to those that are really crowded into their homes? And so I think there's a lot that we can do to keep this high up in people's minds so that as we discuss legislation and efforts at all levels of government, people are continuing to consider these issues.
Excellent points to bring in the road safety angle and goals and measuring impacts of interventions that are made on road safety. We've seen a lot of conversation on air pollution, on that worsening the impacts of COVID. And also great thoughts, Marusha, on some of these more informal systems from Africa. I mean, these are outside of the range many times of government support, but perhaps there's a role for the development finance institution, development finance, both from the private sector, but also from the multilateral development banks in green stimulus to help modernize and improve mobility, not necessarily from large scale projects, but just simply upgrading bus systems. We mentioned the Kigali bus improvements in Rwanda. Other countries in Africa are mapping out public transit and looking at how they can incrementally improve. Other forms of offering other forms of transit, like biking and walking options, might be even more crucial in places like Africa. Sergio, I wonder if you have one final thought on this before I wrap it up.
Yes, Ben. I want to emphasize to mention that big challenge to recover public transportation. It will ask for cities to be completely focused to prioritize public transportation. As I mentioned before, we need to offer, after this crisis, more reliability, better time travel, and better integration, fair integration, especially integration with active models, bicycling and walking, to incentivize this kind of solution because it's safe, it's green, and it's cheaper and democratic. And don't forget about governance. During this crisis, we observed in different parts of the world the lack of coordination, lack of governance, different authorities taking different decisions, different levels of operation, different plans to operate public transportation during this crisis, creating a lot of mess for users. So let's learn with this crisis that you need to have better governance in public transportation, especially in metropolitan zones, to create metropolitan authorities that can manage with a whole vision, a holistic vision to offer better quality, to reduce costs and to improve efficiency in public transportation.
Great final thoughts, and I think we'll actually take this opportunity to wrap it up. I want to thank everyone for joining, our panelists from around the world. We've got China, Mexico, the United States, Belgium, Brazil, and good old Washington, D.C. here. So thank you to all our guests. I see also joining from remote places from D.C., at least here from Indonesia to India to Brazil and Mexico, Colombia. So I hope this was not too a superficial discussion. We can't cover much in an hour's time, but I think we've caught on some of these key issues, and we look to cover issues more going forward. Both WRI and these partners like SLOCAT, Transportation for America, other partners like Transforming Urban Mobility Initiative and GIZ, our partners at the New Mobility Alliance, NUMO, which is hosted at WRI, is hosting a webinar series on these topics. So please look for more information from ourselves and our partners on these issues, as well as some knowledge products and the like. So, you know, I think we've heard the importance of public transport, of biking, walking, of investing in these, and the problems we're dealing with and trying to grapple with. I'm thinking of a quote from Lewis Mumford, who also said you should not, like building more highways is like loosening your belt for an obese person. But he also said, you know, forget the damned motor car and let's build our cities for lovers and friends. And I think that's a moment right now we're all thinking a lot about, and how we should build cities that are for people, that are equal for people and humane to people. And so I hope some of these thoughts have shed some light on that. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and we look to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.